Hello, fellow literati, and welcome to In the Dark, the internet's most laid-back literature show. I'm Nikita, of course, and today's topic is going to be trends. Trends in literature, and this topic I've taken a little bit of a liberty with a question from Isaac, which I suspect may have been a little bit of a meme. So his question was, how do I predict the next big trend? How do I predict the next big trend? Was I whispering the whole time? Hopefully you can hear me there. My voice seems a little bit hoarse. Excuse me. His question was, how do I predict the next big trend in genre fiction so I can make the big bucks easy peasy without actually exhausting any of my creative juices, of which I will be saving for my small poetry scrapbook? A very good question, and we're basically going to be addressing this. We're going to talk about how to use trends in your writing, which I think is essentially what you mean. Memes aside, I'm excited to see that poetry scrapbook. Hook me up with but yeah, so in terms of how do you predict the next big trend? I don't know. If I could predict it myself, I would have written it already, and I would have been making movies and things of that nature, publishing a lot of books. So in terms of actually predicting the next big trend, not gonna be very easy. And in fact, I believe you can't really predict a trend. It would be very difficult, but what we're going to talk about is how to capitalize on trends, how to potentially see what's popular, what's going on, and how to use that in your writing, and how to maybe increase the mass appeal of your thing in terms of trendiness, trends. Trendiness, trends. Okay, so there's a couple of ways that I had in mind for doing this. And again, none of this will necessarily make your book like Twilight, Hunger Games. What made those things so successful? It's kind of a mix of various things, and I'm sure other people can maybe give a more detailed or insightful explanation, but I think a big part of it is luck, being like in the right place at the right time. Part of it is accessibility of language, and accessibility of language and meaning. So they're all very, like 50 Shades of Grey, Twilight. What else is popular? Game of Thrones is a little bit of an exception, I think. And I mean, I would definitely get flack for this, but I think, in a sense, they're all well written. Like, I think it's fair to say that those things were they're perhaps the best representatives of their genre. Although I feel like that's probably not true. By best representatives, I don't mean like the technically most impressive from an academic sense. Hey, you know who's very trendy? Gracie. Where is she? Oh, there she is. I know it might seem like like I'm just using her for views, but she comes of her own free will. Gracie. So what was I saying? Oh yeah. So not from see, the part of the problem, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but bear with me here. Part of the problem is that people look at Here, let me put it this way. This doesn't really apply to your question about genre fiction, but for those people that are writing literary things, let's just put it this way. You're not going to write a literary book, most likely. This is like 99.9% chance. Wow, you see how she's eating? And I said in the last episode that she eats during every episode. She just ate like 20 minutes ago when I was filming the last episode. How am I supposed to be laid back? This is supposed to be a laid back literature show, guys. This is really, really grinding my gears right here. Okay, so for like 99.9% chance, if you're writing a literary thing, it's not going to be like Twilight. It's not going to be like whatever genre fiction thing is popular. Genre fiction, like 100% of the time, reaches way more people. Like, broadly speaking, I'm sure there are exceptions. And again, if okay, like maybe more people have read like Huckleberry Finn, like maybe the classics get a bit more attention. But in terms of like, 1984, like almost without a doubt, more people have read 50 Shades of Grey than 1984. And 1984 is like a very accessible kind of, it's a very straightforward, accessible book in some senses. So yeah, for people that are like, oh, I want to write like a trendy literary book, just completely ignore the genre fiction trends then. Because what's trendy in genre fiction and in popular culture, to a large extent, has very little to do with the literary world, especially if you're interested in like academia. Gracie, that's not safe. Scoot off of here. I don't want her to go next to the candle. Sorry about the squeaky chair. The co-host. There we go. She's not. All right. But yeah, so the trendiness, like in terms of like poetry, publishing in contemporary magazines, like literary journals and so on, the trendy things are completely different there than they are in genre fiction. And that's kind of ties into one of the points I'm going to make in a second. But yeah, so if you're writing genre fiction, I'm not sure exactly how you would go about finding the next big trend. But there's a couple of things that I think you could do that are kind of, they're guaranteed to increase the trendiness of your book or whatever. Not necessarily to make it trendy, but trendy in the sense that it becomes like a phenomenon on its own. But to make it kind of trendy in terms of, you get what I mean, hopefully. But maybe it'll make more sense as I get into the specifics here. And again, so literary and genre fiction, even though that distinction is a little bit, we'll get to that in a different video about how I feel about that now. And like Rupi Kaur, it's like, is it genre fiction? I mean, it's trendy. That's one trend. But okay, let me give you these specifics. But my point is that when you're thinking about trends, you have to think about like what's trendy with your target audience. And this is something that like genre fiction writers understand a lot better because they're actually trying to make money, and not all of them, of course. But in terms of like the successful genre fiction writings, it's like if you're a writer of fantasy, right? You're writing genre fiction and your genre is fantasy. You know who your audience is a lot better than some literary writers would, because literary writers kind of, if I had to generalize, I'd say they write for other literary writers, and basically like it's its own audience, but that audience is very small. But if you're writing fantasy, for example, right, you know to an extent who will be reading it, like who the bulk of the demographic will be. So you have to, for whatever you're writing, you have to think about, you should be aware of what it is you're writing. So if you're writing like a steamy romance, you should be aware that like the people that will likely be reading it, and marketing plays into this a bit, but just like broadly speaking, the audience for romance is like significantly more women than men. Or like vice versa, if you're writing like some fantasy thing, or like an anime whatever, then obviously the audience would be different. So the trendiness, like the trends you would have to appeal to and use, would be different. Okay, so to get to the actual need, that's kind of like the preface, just because what I'm about to talk about actually applies, I think, to like in all cases, but just the specifics would be different. So in terms of, here's some things you can look at. Am I talking too fast? This is supposed to be laid back, but we're learning at a rapid speed. Okay. So in terms of what you can look at specifically, trendy topics. That's kind of the first thing. So what would that? What would be an example of trendy topics? Let's see. Well, some topics. Okay, here's. I should have probably in my notes been a little bit more specific what I meant by that. But like certain topics are always trendy, like love and so on. And this, okay, that that's not a huge hack, but it's like when you're choosing. Essentially, what I mean is when you're choosing a topic for your writing, you can keep in mind like, okay, like what's this about? And as one of like the major topics or one of the subtopics, you can work in things that are trendy, and either they're always trendy, although that's a bit different, a bit difficult rather, because when you pick a timeless topic, and like love, for example, right, or like relationships, it might be difficult to kind of say something unique about it. But then I think to an extent you have to use timeless topics, just because those are the ones that resonate the most with people. And there's only so many things you can even write about. But like whatever, revenge, redemption, those are all like pretty trendy, resonant things. But I think like in terms of trendy topics, I meant more like fidget spinners. So you can work in like a fidget spinner into your thing, or like, whoa, elections, right? It doesn't even need to be like specifically, but it's just like, okay, elections are trendy right now, so you can think about like maybe these characters, maybe there's an election going on, that's kind of like relatable. So when people read that, it's like, oh, that's kind of trendy. And this also ties in a little bit to the medium that you're publishing in, because if you're going to publish it online or like on your Instagram or whatever, then it could be out in a day. Then you can catch like the fidget spinner trend. If you're writing a book that you intend to be published traditionally, all those like micro trends are going to be a real, just I wouldn't even, you can include it, and it'd be kind of like a throwback by the time that it's published, if it's ever published, because that process can take, once the book is finished, it can take like a year or two, and that's again if it's published at all. So that's something that I guess applies to all trendiness. Just something to keep in mind. But events is something you can talk about as being trendy. And also, like with magazine submissions, like if you're submitting a poem, just for example, to a magazine, you can probably like fit in trendy, like some trendy topics, because their review period is usually like only a few months. So if it's like the election, for example, or Trump, just like looking back, like Trump was a huge trendy kind of meme topic. So you had a lot of writers and a lot of everybody basically just being like, "Hey, Trump," and that's like instantly gets you more attention. And it's not limited to politics. It could be like, oh, like SpaceX, haha, like Tesla. I don't know. But like, so events like elections, the presidential stuff. That's just what's coming to mind for some reason. But that's like, those are trendy events. I don't know. The Oscars. You could write a thing about the Oscars. And again, this isn't like, this won't really help you necessarily predict like the next, oh, vampires and werewolves, that were the next like zombie like apocalypse thing. But it'll just make your work perhaps a little bit more trendy and like relatable, if that makes sense. Social movements is another thing that you can include. So like whatever, feminism, things like that. Those are like trendy, and I don't mean like in a vague sense, but like specific aspects of social movements or whatever. Like if you want to, you can do like a Black Lives Matter thing or like an alt-right thing. I don't want this to get political, but just, and I don't know why it's like only politics coming to mind. It doesn't necessarily need to be, well, for social movements, I guess it's always political. But in terms of the other things, it doesn't have to be political. And just on a side note, I don't know if for you this is interesting, but maybe for somebody else it'll be interesting. I'd be careful with like, okay, like to be transparent, like I don't like politics in creative work very much. Maybe we can talk about that later. But I would just be careful, because if you're gonna like pick a side or write a thing, it's like, especially right now, it's very polarized. So if you write a thing that's like from one perspective, you're basically gonna just like piss everyone else off on the other side. And for a lot of people, maybe that's fine. But just something to keep in mind, that it's like, once you go political, you can't really go back. And it's really, yeah, it's not really about the art at that point. At least for everybody else, you'll just be like, oh, this guy's X, Y, and Z. Okay, and the last thing is techniques and styles of writing. So for genre fiction, I'm sure there's a variety of like trendy tropes and so on. I don't read a whole lot of genre fiction, but if that's what you're interested in, then you'd probably have to do some research in terms of like, look at maybe like the top 3 bestsellers that are similar to what you want to do for the past couple of years, and just pick them all up and read them. Look at their like topics, the subject matter, what the themes are, and so on. Characterization, characters, like the social dynamics. There's a lot of stuff that's kind of like thinly veiled political commentary, or just explicit political commentary. And then like technical things, so like how the chapters are structured, the length of paragraphs, and so on. And this also applies, of course, to like literature and poetry. And that's something that, like, okay, so if you want to write trendy poetry, and it depends who your audience is. Like if you're writing a poem that you want to submit to the Paris Review, God forbid, but you want to submit it to like a really prestigious literary journal, you don't want to be writing like Rupi Kaur. And I don't mean that like in an offensive way, it's just that's trendy, and there's a lot of people that like that. But like a highbrow audience will not like that. So you got to be aware of that. But then if you're writing on Instagram, for example, or you want to reach a similar audience, you need to be aware that like this is what's trendy now. This is what people like for one reason or another. That kind of like minimalistic, simple, no punctuation, really like threadbare style. And I don't mean like copy it necessarily, but you just have to be aware of it and maybe adjust your vision and what you're doing to at least kind of play off of that to some extent, or like harness that, whatever is cool or attractive to people about that. And that'll require a little bit of critical thought and like research to figure out why is this the way it is, and like why are the artists doing it this way, why do people enjoy it, why does like their audience enjoy it, and stuff like that. So that's that's pretty much all I have to say about that topic. Hopefully that's helpful. That was like a huge journey. I didn't expect that to be so complicated. But yeah, so in terms of like predicting the next big trend, you just gotta keep trying. Ultimately, I don't think you can really predict it, but you can help by kind of seeing what's going on in your industry that you're interested in. See what what's successful now using these criteria, and then see how you can take what's popular and kind of put your own twist onto it. That would be my recommendation for trendiness. But just like on a super, well, it's not really a side note. It's actually to answer your question more specifically. I think if you're actually interested in genre fiction, like trends don't really matter that much. And maybe I'm wrong. Like again, I'm not a big genre fiction buff, but really, like I think what genre fiction comes down to is like knowing who your audience is and just marketing. So you want to write something clever and cool and like technically well done that your audience will enjoy, and then just marketing it like really well. But yeah, so thank you guys for watching. Hope you learned something. If you have any questions, leave them below. I do have a lot of questions that basically all of this week is already filled up with questions or videos that are inspired by questions. But yeah, if you have any other questions, by all means leave them below, and I will answer them as soon as possible. Thank you for watching. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys tomorrow in the next video. All right, peace.